Hello, good evening, folks. How you doing today, folks? I hope you're all doing well, right? And welcome to today's class, folks. Today we're going to explore a topic, right? That although it may seem simple at first glance, but actually plays a fundamental role in children's learning and cognitive development. And as you can appreciate on the screen, the topic is material mediation basics, educational materials for children, right? As future educator folks, we often spend a lot of time thinking about what content we want to teach. However, something equally important is how we can help a student understand that content, right? That is where educational maturity becomes essential. Remember that they are much more than classroom decorations or resources we use it to make lessons look attractive, right? And something important, folks, that when they are selected and used correctly, they become powerful tools that help children understand ideas, solve problems, and actively participate in the learning process. So, so through this lesson, folks, we will explore the meaning of material mediation, the educational theories that support it, that I'm pretty sure that you get some knowledge about some psychologists like Jeremy Bronner, Lev Vygotsky, Jean Piaget, etc., right? So the characteristics of effective educational materials and some practical strategies that you can eventually apply in your classrooms, especially if you're doing your professional practicum, right? At the end of this presentation, folks, I hope you'll have a much clearer understanding of what educational materials are, such an important part of is effective teaching, right? So, as you can appreciate there, folks, and I'm pretty sure that you got some knowledge about what materials mediation is. Let me tell you that this refers to the use of physical objects, right? Educational resources and learning tools that help children understand concepts more effectively. And remember that these materials act as bridges between what the student already know and the new knowledge they are expected to learn, right? One thing I always like to emphasize here, folks, is that children learn best when they can experience learning rather than simply listen to explanations, right? Think about how children naturally explore the world around them before they can read or write what they learned, right? By touching objects, observing colors, manipulating toys, building structures, asking questions, and even experimenting with their environment. Remember that when they are young children, they are curious, right? Of experimenting many things. Educational material folks take advantage of this natural curiosity. Why? Let me provide an example, folks. Let's suppose that you're a math teacher, right? And you're teaching geometric shapes. Of course, you could simply draw a circle, a square, or a triangle on the whiteboard, right? A student would probably recognize them, but however, learning becomes much more meaningful if a student can actually hold wooden shapes, right? Compare their sizes, sort them into groups, or even build objects using those shapes. At that point, folks, they are no longer passive listeners. They become active participants in the learning process, especially folks when you use realia, right? The real objects there. The same principles applies to language learning, folks. If you're teaching vocabulary related to fruits, showing real fruit or realistic models usually has a much greater impact than simply presenting a list of words on a slide, right? Remember that it is in here that where students can observe the colors, textures, sizes, and sometimes even smell or taste them. These sensory experiences make learning more memorable, right? Another important idea, folks, is that educational materials support different learning styles. Some children understand information better through visual resources such as pictures, diagrams, and charts. Some others benefit from manipulating objects with their hands, while some learn more effectively through movement or collaborative activity, right? By incorporating folks different types of materials, teachers create opportunity for learners to participate successfully. This is not new for you folks because you got some experience about this, especially in the first midterm test where you were creating a digital portfolio with these different types of materials, right? Something that we should always remember, folks, is that educational materials do not replace, right, the teachers. Instead, they support the teacher's work. Remember that the teacher remains the guide who decides when, why, sorry, and how each material should be used according to the learning objective. And ultimately, folks, the purpose of material mediation is to transform abstract ideas into meaningful learning experiences that children can easily understand and remember. Right? Sorry. Now, here, as you can appreciate, folks, whenever we talk about educational practices, it's important to understand that theories that support them, right? Mediation, the material mediation, folks, is not simply based on classroom experience, and it is supported by well-established educational theories developed by researchers, right? Who dedicated many years to studying how children learn, especially the psychologists that I mentioned before, like Jeremy Brunner, Lev Vygotsky, Jean Piaget, and you can see you can appreciate on the screen, right? And one of the most influential scholars is Lev Vygotsky, right, folks? That, as I said before, I'm pretty sure that you got some knowledge about his theory, right? According to his sociocultural theory, folks, learning occurs primarily through social interaction, right? Children don't develop knowledge completely on their own, right? Instead, they learn by interacting with teachers, classmates, even with their parents and the environment around them. Something important that I would like to highlight here, folks, is that Vygotsky also introduced the concept of the zone proximal development, right? Which refers to the difference between what a learner can accomplish independently and what they can achieve with appropriate guidance, right? Educational material, folks, become part of that guidance because they provide support while students are developing new skills. For instance, folks, a child who is learning addition may initially struggle with mental calculations, right? However, if the teacher provides counting cubes or colored counters, the child can physically manipulate the object and gradually understand the mathematical process, right? As the learner becomes more confident, those materials become less necessary because the concept has already been internalized, right? That is related to the Vygotsky theory, folks. And another key theorist that we got is Jean Piaget, right? Whose constructivist theory explains that children actively construct knowledge through direct interaction, right, with environment. And according to Piaget, folks, remember that learning is not simply receiving information from the teacher. Instead, students build their own understanding through exploration, observation, experimentation, and even reflection. Remember that when they are children, they are curious, right? As I said before. This is why hands-on activities are so valuable, folks. For example, instead of explaining the concept of floating and sinking only through words, a student understand much better when they conduct a simple experiment by placing different objects into water and observing what happens, right? Through this experience, folks, They discover patterns, make predictions, test ideas, and probably develop deeper conceptual understanding, right? There's something important, folks, and please don't forget that these two theories have something very important in common. Both recognize that learning becomes more meaningful when students actively participate rather than passively receive information, right? Finally, folks, we should also remember that educational materials should reflect children's cultural and social context, right? Materials become much more meaningful when students can identify with them. As teachers, and you as a future teachers, we should always try to use examples, objects, images, and even situations that are familiar to our learners, right? This helps students establish a stronger connection between classrooms learning and their everyday experiences. In conclusion, for this one, folks, we can say that educational theory constantly show that carefully selected materials do much more than make lesson interesting, right? They promote exploration, support independent thinking, facilitate deeper understanding, and encourage meaningful learning experiences, right? That the students are likely to remember long after the lesson has ended. Now, regarding to the basic scheme for material mediation, folks, and now that you have understood, sorry, that you have understood what material mediation is and the theories that support it, like the psychologist that I mentioned before, we can say that an important thing to understand is that using educational materials should never be random, right? Something important, don't forget that, okay? Every material, folks, we bring into the classroom should clear educational purpose, right? Sometimes some teachers become excited because they find colorful resources or interesting games. But before selecting any material, we should first ask ourselves a simple question that I've always said. What do I want my students to learn? Everything, remember that something important, folks, and you cannot forget is that sorry, everything starts with the learning objective, right? Because remember that at the end of the class, we have to achieve the objective that we proposed at the beginning, right? Once the and once the objective is clear, folks, we can choose or even create materials that help students achieve that objective. And according to those objective, folks, we have to select the appropriate material for our students, right? For example, if my objective is to teach children about the life cycle of a butterfly, I wouldn't simply show them a written definition. Instead, I might use pictures, plastic models, flashcards, or even short videos that allow students to visualize each stage of the process, right? To a better understanding of this. And after selecting the material, folks, the next step is to organize how students will interact with them. And remember that this interaction is extremely important because learning occurs through active participation. Students should manipulate, observe, compare, and classify, build, or even solve problems using the material provided. As teacher, and you as future teachers, the role, or I would say our role is to get that interaction, right? We observe students, encourage participation, provide support when necessary, and ask questions that stimulate thinking. Finally, folks, after a student have worked with that material, we need to evaluate whenever learning actually occurred. Reflection is also an essential part of this process because it allows us to determine whether the materials were effective or whether we need to modify them for future lessons, right? So some of the characteristics that we got here, folks, And something important that we have to take into account is that not every colorful or attractive object automatically becomes a good teaching resource, right? Effective educational material share several important characteristics that make learning more meaningful and engaging, right? First, I would say, folks, that material should always be age appropriate. As I said before, we need to know that sort of students we got in the classroom and what are their needs. And according to that one, we have to select the appropriate materials, right? This means, folks, that they should match children's cognitive, emotional, and physical development, and a material design for preschool children would probably be too simple for old learners, right? While materials designed for old students might be too complex for young children. Second, I would say that educational material should capture children's attention, right? We know that young learners are naturally curious. So, colorful images, interesting textures, interactive elements, and creative design make maintained their motivation throughout their lessons. Safety is another essential characteristic, especially when working with young children, folks. Materials should be durable, not toxic, and free from small pieces that could become hurdles, right? Safety should always be one of the prioritized when selecting classroom resources, right? Another important things, folks, or another important characteristic that I would like to mention here is that effective materials should stimulate multiple senses, right? Children learn more effectively when they can see, touch, move, manipulate, and sometimes even hear or smell the learning materials. The more senses involved in learning, the stronger and longer lasting the learning experience becomes, right? Flexibility is equally important, folks. Remember that a single material should easily be useful for different activities and different learning objectives, right? For example, building blocks can be used not only for mathematics, but also for language development, problem solving activities, and cooperative learning, right? Finally, educational material should promote inclusion and cultural relevance. Students should feel represented in the classroom. Resources they use when materials reflect children cultures, right? Language experiences and communities learning becomes much more meaningful and motivating. At this point, folks, in a face-to-face class, I would normally organize a short discussion activity. And please pay attention to this one because in the next session, in the presential session, we're gonna discuss this one, right? Um, I would say, folks, that the purpose of this activity is to encourage students to connect today's topic with their own educational experiences, right? Please take note about the questions that you can appreciate on the screen and be ready for next session there. Now, one of the most important responsibility teachers have is understanding that children develop at different stages, right? Because of this, folks, educational material should always be adapted to children's developmental characteristics. During early childhood, approximately between the ages of 3 and 5, children learn primarily through sensory experiences, right? As Jean Piaget stated in one of the cognitive mental stages, right? They need opportunity to touch objects, explore textures, manipulate materials, observe colors, and interact with their environment. At this stage, learning is highly concrete and experiential, right? As children grow older, folks, around 6 to 8 years old, they gradually begin understanding symbols and representations. I don't know, folks, if you remember when you were taking the course of theories of learning language learning that one of the psychologists, Jeremy Branner, talked about the modes of representations, right? So they can use pictures, cards, simple diagrams, basic models, and organize the learning systems to support other thinkers, right? Later, folks, between 9 and 12 years old, a student begin developing more advanced reasoning abilities, although they become capable of understanding abstract concepts. Concrete materials continue supporting their learning, especially when introducing complex topics, right? And it is in here, folks, that teachers should also remember that children's motor skills continue development throughout these stages, right? Materials should also, therefore, be easy to manipulate according to student physical ability. This is related to the four cognitive stages development that Jean Piaget stated, right? Remember, folks, that educational material is very dependent of the subject we're teaching, right? For example, mathematics, manipulative are extremely valuable because they help students, right? Visualize numerical relationships and resources such as counting blocks, circles, measuring tools, geometric solids, and number lines make mathematical concepts much easier to understand. In literacy instruction, materials such as alphabet cards, vocabulary flashcards, sorry, storybooks, word puzzles, or even phonics games help students develop reading and writing skills in an engaging way, right? In science, I would say that it's another subject where educational materials play a crucial role. Instead of only reading scientific concepts, students benefit greatly from observing models, conducting experiments, examining plants, animals, rocks, or other real-life specimens, right? In social study, folks, maps, photographs, historical artifacts, and community resources help students connect classroom learning with the real world around them. Arts and music naturally require creative resources such as musical instruments, painting materials, modeling clay, craft supplies, and digital media that encourage creativity and self-expressions. Although every subject requires folks different resources, they all share one common objective, making learning more concrete, interactive, and meaningful for students, right? Having good educational materials, folks, is only one part of or effective teaching, right? Knowing how to use those materials is equally important. Remember that teachers should always introduce new material carefully. Before a student begin working independently, it is important to demonstrate how the materials should be used and explain the purpose of this activity. Something important instruction that we have to give to the student, right? After the introduction, folks, a student should have enough time to explore freely. This exploration stage allows curiosity to develop naturally before formal instruction begins. And as a student work with the materials, teachers should encourage experimentation and independent thinking instead of immediately providing the correct answer. Open-ended conversations, remember, that can also help students explain their reasoning, justify their ideas, and develop higher order thinking skills. And let me tell you that observation is another important strategy. Teachers should carefully observe how students interact with the materials, identify misconceptions, and provide additional support whenever necessary, right? And it is also beneficial, folks, to rotate classroom materials periodically, right? Changing resources keeps students motivated and prevents classroom routines from becoming repetitive. At the end, folks, remember that classroom organization plays a major role in successful material mediation. Materials should be stored in accessible and organized spaces so students can use them independently while maintaining responsibility for classroom resources, right? Now, folks, that we have discussed how design and implement educational materials effectively, it is also important to recognize that teachers often face different challenges when trying to use these resources, right, in the classroom. Fortunately, every challenge can usually be addressed with creativity, planning, and even flexibility. And one of the most common challenges is having a limited budget, right? Many schools simply do not have enough financial resources to purchase expensive educational materials. However, this should never discourage us as teachers. In fact, some of the most effective learning materials are inexpensive or even free. For example, instead of buying commercial manipulative, teachers can create their own materials using recycled cardboard, board caps, popsicle sticks, plastic containers, newspapers, magazines, or natural resources such as leaves, stands, shells, and seeds, right? These handmade materials can be just as effective because what really matters is how they are integrated into the learning process, not how much money was spent on them, right? Another challenge, folks, that we got is classroom organization and storage. As teachers collect more material throughout the school year, it becomes increasingly difficult to keep everything organized. This is why having labeled containers, shelf folders, and storage boxes is essential. A well-organized classroom, folks, allow to both teacher and student to access materials quickly, reducing wasted instructional time and creating more efficient learning environment. And the third challenge falls involves ensuring that all learners have equal opportunity to participate. Every classroom includes a student with different learning styles, ability, and educational needs. Some students may benefit from visual resources, while others need for tactile or hands-on experiences. Therefore, teachers should provide multiple representation of the same concept whenever possible, right? This inclusive approach ensures that every student has access to meaningful learning opportunity. Remember, folks, here, if we contextualize all of the challenges to our classroom that we got in our country, is that we got a lot of in some schools we got a lot of students and the space is too short, too small, and there are some teachers that they designed their own material using the didactic materials that the government gave, and but then they get rid of from them, right? So they don't maintain those resources. Once the resource, one the material has been used, they'd get rid of them, right? Now, folks, we've now reached the final part of today's lesson. And throughout this presentation, folks, we'd explore the meaning of material mediation, the educational theories that support it, and the characteristics of effective educational materials, even the developmental needs of children and practical strategies for implementing these resources successfully in the classroom, right? One important conclusion, folks, that we can draw is that educational materials are much more than teaching aids. They are powerful instructional tools that help children constructing knowledge through meaningful experience, right? And you, as future teachers, your responsibility goes beyond selection and transfer materials, right? That I'm pretty sure that you do it. Believe me, you already done it, right? And you need to ensure that every resource you use has a clear educational purpose, supports the learning objective, and responds to the developmental characteristic and individual needs for our students. And When we carefully choose and implement educational material, folks, we create learning environments where students become active participants rather than passive listeners, right? Remember that they observe, they manipulate, experiment, collaborate, ask questions, solve problems, and gradually develop greater independence in their learning. Another important idea I like to remember, folks, is that effective teaching doesn't depend on having the most expensive classroom resources. Instead, it depends on the thoughtful planning, creativity, and our ability to adapt available materials to our students' need. Even simple objects can become meaningful learning tools when they are used intentionally, right? And as you continue your journey as future educator, folks, I encourage you to begin observing classrooms with a more critical perspective. Pay attention to the materials teachers use, analyze how students interact with them, and think about how those resources contribute to learning. Those observations will help you develop your own teaching style and improve your ability to design engaging learning experiences. Probably some of you are giving your professional practicum and probably you have experienced this, right? Finally, folks, always remember that children learn best when they are actively involved in the learning process, and educational materials encourage curiosity, exploration, creativity, collaboration, and critical thinking, all of which are essential skills for lifelong learning, right? That has been all for this session, folks. Thank you very much for your attention, and please be ready for next class, okay? If you forgot something about this explanation, folks, go to the platform, look for the video that we got there, the recorded video that we got there, and you can take a look at it, right? Just for refreshing the knowledge about this one, and be ready for next class, okay? Okay, folks, that has been all, and see you. Bye bye. See you next class.